So this tutorial is going to walk you through something called the dispersion effect, which is where you take a subject and make it look like they're dissolving into little bits. So we're going to start with the image of a person, and we're going to make 3 different copies of that person, and each copy is going to be doing something different. There's going to be an empty background where we remove the person. There's going to be a version of the person where some bits have been removed. And then there's going to be a version that has the bits that are floating away, the dispersion effect. We'll go over how to make each of those layers. So first of all, when you're choosing your image, you want to make sure that there's enough space for the little bits to float away. If there's not, you can use the crop tool to increase the size of your image. Before you do that, make sure the option for Content Aware Fill is selected in the menu bar. Photoshop will then fill the new space with stuff that looks similar to the rest of the background. So once your image is the right size, the first thing we want to do is make a layer that isolates your subject from your background. So start off by creating a duplicate of the layer your subject is on. Just right-click and select Duplicate Layer. Make sure the new layer is highlighted. Go up to the top menu and go to Select, and then Subject, and let Photoshop select your person. You can use any of the selection tools to make touch-ups if Photoshop doesn't get it quite right. But when you're happy with the selection, you're just going to go down to the Layer Mask button. And then, if you hide the layer underneath, you can see that Photoshop has now masked out all the area around your subject. Now, the second layer that we need is a background, and I recommend a very simple, non-distracting background. There's a couple different ways to do this. One, you can just go down to the Adjustment Layers button, make a solid color, and pick a light gray. Nothing wrong with that. You can also go to Google and do a search for portrait backgrounds, like studio backgrounds, and pick sort of a random abstract background that you like the look of. Just copy and paste it and put it on a layer behind your subject. If you want to keep the background that came with your subject, you can do that too. You can use your skills from the Removing a Person tutorial to create a copy of your image that has just the background and not the person. Usually a content-aware fill will do the job. So at this point you should have 2 layers, a background with no subject and a subject with no background. We're going to make a new copy of the subject with no background. And I would name this new one Dispersion, just so we don't get them confused. Now we're going to be using some new tools on this dispersion layer, but before we can do that, we have to get rid of this layer mask. And we're going to do that by applying it. So if you right-click on the layer mask and go to Apply, it will then permanently delete everything around the figure. So then I want you to go up to the Filter option in the top menu bar and go down to Liquify. And Liquify allows you to distort the layer in all kinds of ways. We're going to use what's called the Forward Warp tool, which is the top tool on the bar on the left. And what that does is, if you imagine that the layer is made out of wet paint, it's kind of like putting your finger in that paint and smearing it. So you're going to click on the figure in the parts that you want to be dispersing, and you're going to pull the color out by clicking and dragging. You want to work with a fairly large brush for this, and try to grab only the edge of the part that you want to disintegrate. In this example, I wouldn't want to move the entire leg. This step is going to make sure when we add our little bits that they're going to be the same color as our subject. You want these distorted areas to be pulled out wider and longer than you think you're going to need them. It's better to have too much than too little. Now, if you accidentally move something that you didn't want to, you can use the second tool on the toolbar, which is called the Reconstruct tool. Just paint over stuff and it'll revert it back to the way that it was. So once you have the distortion the way that you want it, at least for now, you can always come back and change it, but hit OK in the bottom right corner and you'll see that your layer is now updated. But this isn't really what we want it to look like. So we're going to add a new layer mask to it. And you can use the Control-I shortcut to make sure it's entirely black. So it's hiding everything. So now you're going to switch to the paintbrush tool and paint white on that layer mask to bring back bits of that distortion. But here's the fun part. You get to decide what shape those little bits are going to be. And you can choose any shape that there's a brush for. You can use random spatter effects, you can use squares, you can use smoke, you can experiment with all kinds of things. It's worth taking 60 seconds to talk a little bit about how brushes work in Photoshop, just so that you understand how to make the brushes do what you want. If you go to your brushes panel on the side here, if you don't see the icon, go up to Window and then Brushes. This brush setting window has a couple really useful things. First of all, under Brush Tip Shape, there is a slider for spacing, and this controls how frequently the brush will make a mark. So if you want to scatter things all over the place, then you want to spread the spacing out. Under Shape Dynamics, there's a slider for size jitter, which makes each mark that the brush makes vary in size. The larger the number, the more the size varies. There's also an angle jitter so that not all of the brush marks are going to be facing exactly the same way. Very useful to create randomness. And under the scattering option, there is a scatter slider, and if you move that up, it means that the marks the brush makes get further away from your cursor when you're making them. So again, it can spread them out much further. So all of those are settings that you probably want to move up a little bit, and you can look at the guide at the bottom of the window, which will show you approximately the kind of mark that you're going to make when you draw. So experiment with a few of these before you decide what you want to do for your good copy. Just make sure when you are painting that your opacity setting at the top is set to 100%. Another thing that might be useful is when you have your layer mask selected, you can go to the Properties window here and turn the density down. And that lets you kind of see what the mask is hiding, and that can be useful to see when you're trying to figure out where to paint your dots. Just remember to put it back up to 100 when you're done. Alright, so we're most of the way there. We have the pieces that are floating off of our subject, but at the moment our subject is still solid. So that means we need to go to our middle subject layer, use the same brush that you were using to create the little bits, and we're going to paint black onto that layer mask. And what that's going to do is start creating little holes. Now you want those holes to be mostly on the side of the figure where the bits are coming off. And the trick is to try to get the holes on that layer to match up with the bits on the other layer so that it looks like a natural transition. Remember that if you mess up and you erase too much, you can switch to a normal white brush and just paint the area back in and try again. Okay, so that's definitely enough for you to start trying this out, and then you're going to create your own dispersion piece of art.